traditionally admired. Prinzel was the athlete-poet, von Igelfeld the scholar. Well, scholar, one would probably have to say. If von Igelfeld had been asked to stipulate a Platonic von Igelfeld, an ideal template for all von Igelfelds, then he would have chosen Prinzel for this without the slightest hesitation. Of the three professors, von Igelfeld was undoubtedly the most distinguished. He was the author of a seminal work on Romance philology, Portuguese Irregular Verbs, a work of such majesty that it dwarfed all other books in the field. It was a lengthy book of almost 1,200 pages, and was the result of years of research into the etymology and vagaries of Portuguese verbs. It had been well received. Not that there had ever been the slightest doubt about that, and indeed one reviewer had simply written, "There is nothing more to be said on this subject. Nothing." Von Igelfeld had taken this compliment in the spirit in which it had been intended. But there was, in his view, a great deal more to be said, largely by way of exposition of some of the more obscure or controversial points touched upon in the book, and, for many years, he continued to say it. This was mostly done at conferences, where von Igelfeld's papers on Portuguese irregular verbs were often the highlight of proceedings. Not that this eminence always bore the fruit that might be expected. Unfortunately, it was Prinzel, not von Igelfeld, who had received the honorary doctorate from the University of Palermo, and many people, including von Igelfeld, thought that this might be a case of mistaken identity. After all, from the viewpoint of the fairly diminutive Sicilian professors who bestowed the honor, three tall Germans might have been difficult to tell apart. These doubts, however, were never aired, as that would have been a breach of civility and a threat to the friendship. But, just as the doubts were never mentioned, neither was the honorary doctorate. At the annual Congress of Romance Philology in Zurich, the three professors decided to stay in a small village on the edge of the lake. There was an excellent train which took them into the city each morning for the meeting, and in the evening they could even return by the regular boat, which called at the jetty no more than 5 minutes from the hotel. It was altogether a much more satisfactory arrangement than staying in Zurich itself, surrounded by banks and expensive watch shops. As von Igelfeld remarked to the others, "Have you noticed how Zurich ticks? Clummet, clummet, ding! I could never sleep in such a town." The Hotel Carl Gustav, in which the three professors stayed, was a large, old-fashioned establishment much favored by families from Zurich who wanted to get away, but not too far away. Anxious bankers, into whose very bones the Swiss work ethic had penetrated, stayed there for their holidays. It was highly convenient for them, as they could tell their wives they were going for a walk in the hotel grounds, and then slip off to the railway station and be in their offices in Zurich within 20 minutes. They could then return 2 hours later to pretend that they had been in the woods or at the lakeside, whereas in reality they had been accepting deposits and discounting bills of exchange. In this way, certain Zurich financiers had acquired the reputation of never going on holiday at all, which filled their rivals with feelings of dread and guilt. Prinzel had arrived first and taken the best room, the one with the uninterrupted view of the lake. He had felt slightly uneasy about this, as it was a room which should really have gone to von Igelfeld, who always got the best of everything on the strength of Portuguese irregular verbs. For this reason, Prinzel was careful not to mention the view, and contrived to keep von Igelfeld out of his room so he couldn't see it for himself. Unterholzer, who always got the worst of what was on offer, had a slightly gloomy room at the side of the hotel above the dining room, and his view was that of the hotel tennis court. "I look out onto the tennis court," he announced one evening as the three gathered for a glass of mineral water on the hotel terrace. "Ah," said von Igelfeld, "and have you seen people playing on this tennis court?" "I saw 4 Italian guests using it," said Prinzel. "They played a very energetic game until one of them appeared to have a heart attack, and they stopped." The three professors contemplated this remarkable story for a few moments. Even here, in these perfect surroundings where everything was so safe, so assured, mortality could not be kept at bay. The Swiss could guarantee everything, could coordinate anything, but ultimately mortality was no respecter of timetables. Then Prinzel had an idea. Tennis did not look too difficult. The long summer evening stretched out before them, and the court, since the sudden departure of the Italians, was empty. "We could perhaps have a game of tennis ourselves," he suggested. The others looked at him. "I've never played," said von Igelfeld. "Nor I," said Unterholzer. "Chess, yes. Tennis, no." "But that's no reason not to play," von Igelfeld added quickly. "Tennis, like any activity, can be mastered if one knows the principles behind it. In that respect, it must be like language. The understanding of simple rules produces an understanding of a language. What could be simpler?" Unterholzer and Prinzel agreed, and Prinzel was dispatched to speak to the manager of the hotel to find out whether tennis equipment and a book of the rules of tennis could be borrowed. The manager was somewhat surprised at the request for the book, but in an old hotel most things can be found, and he eventually came up with an ancient dog-eared handbook from the games cupboard. This was The Rules of Lawn Tennis by Captain Geoffrey Pembleton, B.A., Cambridge, Tennis Blue, sometime county champion of Cambridgeshire, and published in 1923, before the tiebreaker was invented. Armed with Pembleton's treatise, described by von Igelfeld to the amusement of the others as this great work of Cambridge scholarship, the three professors strode confidently onto the court. Captain Pembleton had thoughtfully included several chapters describing tennis technique, and here all the major strokes were illustrated with little dotted diagrams showing the movement of the arms and the disposition of the body. It took no more than 10 minutes for von Igelfeld and Prinzel to feel sufficiently confident to begin a game. Unterholzer sat on a chair at the end of the net and declared himself the umpire. The first service, naturally, was taken by von Igelfeld, who raised his racket in the air as recommended by Captain Pembleton and hit the ball in the direction of Prinzel. The tennis service is not a simple matter, and, unfortunately, von Igelfeld did not manage to get any of his serves over the net. Everything was a double fault. Love 15, love 30, love 40, "Game to Professor Dr. Prinzel," called out Unterholzer. "Professor Dr. Prinzel to serve." Prinzel, who had been waiting patiently to return von Igelfeld's serve, his feet positioned in exactly the way advised by Captain Pembleton, now quickly consulted the book to refresh his memory. Then, throwing the tennis ball high into the air, he brought his racket down with convincing force and drove the ball into the net. Undeterred, he tried again, and again after that, but the score remained obstinately one-sided. Love 15, love 30, love 40, "Game to Professor Dr. von Igelfeld," Unterholzer intoned. "Professor Dr. von Igelfeld to serve." And so it continued, as the number of games mounted up. Neither player ever succeeded in winning a game other than by the default of the server. At several points the ball managed to get across the net, and on 1 or 2 occasions it was even returned. But this was never enough to result in the servers winning a game. Unterholzer continued to call out the score, and attracted an occasional sharp glance from von Igelfeld, who eventually suggested that the rules of tennis be consulted to see who should win in such circumstances.